Hello again and welcome back to the channel. In this lesson we're going to be going on to the concluding part of the video on the endocrine system. It will be split into the following sections. So we're going to do a quick recap of part 1, and then we're going to look at the pathway of a normal hormonal response. Then we're going to look at some descriptions or definitions of key terms you need to know. We will also then be looking at the two main types of hormones. We'll be talking about what homeostasis is. We'll look at examples of how homeostasis works to maintain the body's internal environment. We'll look at what negative feedback means at the end. So let's go into it. Okay, so this is on page 3 of the worksheet on the endocrine system. In the previous video, we talked about what hormones are, which are chemical messengers sent around in the blood from glands which secrete them in order to bring about a response in target organs and tissues. We then talked about examples of glands, the hormones they produce, and the responses that you see from those hormones. In this lesson, we're going to delve in a little deeper into how exactly hormones work. So the first question says, or the first box requires you to put in a flow chart of the path of a hormonal response. So you start off with some sort of a stimulus. Your brain then realizes that something's happened. Your brain then causes or sends a signal to your glands, either directly or indirectly using a master gland, to bring about the secretion of a hormone. The hormone is then secreted into the blood. It travels everywhere in the blood, but it only brings about its response in target cells which make up tissues and organs. And those target cells will have receptors which are complementary in shape to the shape of the hormone molecules. Once they bind to each other, it brings about a response in those tissues or organs made up of those target cells. And hopefully after that, whatever caused the stimulus at the start will then be stopped, or your body will go to a level that stops the stimulus from being sent to the brain. So that's the pathway of a hormonal response. Then you've got a few key terms that you need to know. So starting off with target cells, we've talked about target cells before, and target cells have receptors in their membranes which are complementary in shape to the shape of the hormone molecules. And so when the hormones bind to the receptors in the membranes of those target cells, they bring about some sort of a response. We'll talk about some examples of those later. Then the next stage is target tissues and organs, which are basically just tissues and organs that are made up of specific target cells with the right sorts of receptors. Then the next question talks about what a hormone receptor is. These are special proteins found in the cell membranes of target cells, and they bind temporarily to hormone molecules which are complementary in shape, and then they bring about a response in those cells. So next, let's talk about the main types of hormones. There are two main types of hormone. First, you've got proteins, so protein-based hormones. An example is adrenaline. Now with protein-based hormones, because they're quite large molecules that can't pass through the membrane very easily, they bind to receptors on the surface of target cells and bring about a response within the cells. with steroid hormones, which are lipid-based hormones, basically made up of fat, so an example would be something like estrogen, they can pass through the membrane directly because the membrane itself is mainly made up of lipids, phospholipids. And as such, the lipid-based hormones can pass through the membrane into the cells and bring about their responses directly within the cell. Okay, so now let's go on to the next stage, which is homeostasis. So homeostasis is a term used to describe the mechanisms within the body which maintain a constant internal environment. So that's also from a Greek word, and stasis means to stay the same. So they're trying to maintain the same conditions within the body, or at least within a very tight range, which is acceptable to the normal function of the body. Okay, so we're going to deal with three main examples of how homeostasis works. So let's start off with temperature regulation. Now, it's important to maintain the internal temperature of the body within a tight range. If the temperature goes too low, then molecules or particles move too slowly. And so reactions take far too long to happen, and that can be detrimental for the body. Also, if your body temperature is too high, it can also be detrimental because it causes molecules to move too quickly. Why would that be an issue? In certain molecules, like certain structural proteins and enzymes and so on, a very high temperature can cause their shapes to change. And if their shapes change, they stop working properly. And that is obviously a problem. So you can't have the temperature too low, you can't have it too high. It has to be just right, a bit like Goldilocks. Okay, so let's have a look at the diagram that's provided to show exactly how this would work. So if your body temperature drops too low, your brain gets information from receptors all around the body, including some within the brain itself, which tell the brain that the temperature has dropped too low or that the temperature has dropped too high. Now, the normal desirable temperature is 37 degrees centigrade, in humans, that is. So, when the body temperature drops too low, your body has two options, which it usually uses in tandem together. Tandem means together. And the two options it has are to try to keep as much heat as it already has, but also to try to generate some more heat in order to maintain, or in order to get the temperature either back up to its normal level or to maintain it for as long as possible. So how does it achieve that? In our evolutionary past, we used to be a lot hairier, and some people are still very hairy, but most of us aren't particularly hairy. And as such, one of the responses is that hairs on your skin become more erect. And that means that you can end up with a blanket of air, which is heated by the body, which helps to maintain the heat within the body. As I said, in humans, or in modern humans, that isn't necessarily that helpful, but you can still see that response. What else can the body do? It can divert blood flow away from your extremities, places like your fingers, your ears, your nose, your toes, and so on. The idea there is that in those parts of the body, the surface area to volume ratio is higher. And as such, you tend to lose heat faster in those parts of the body. So if you divert blood flow away from those parts of the body, you're less likely to lose heat. And of course, in fact, the largest organ you have is your skin. And as such, when you are cold or when you're losing a lot of heat, your blood flow to your skin drops. And that's why you can go quite pale when you are in very cold conditions. So all of those are intended to try to keep the warmth, the heat within the body. But then there's another option. The body can generate a little bit more heat itself. So your largest internal organ, your liver, does a lot of different activities. And what it can do is it can, activity within the liver can shoot upwards in response to being cold and losing heat. And that, because of the processes going on, releases some extra heat to warm up your core, because your core body temperature is the key. You want to try to maintain the core body temperature. Your body will sacrifice certain non-essential parts, but your core has to maintain a certain temperature. So that's on the cold side. On the hot side, your body is trying desperately, if you become too hot, to lose that extra heat. So how would it do that? Remember when I talked about when your body gets too cold and you drop blood flow to the skin? Well, in situations when you're too hot, the opposite happens and you increase blood flow, what we call vasodilation. So cutting off blood flow is vasoconstriction, increasing blood flow is called vasodilation. And vaso just means to do with blood vessels, and dilation means to get wider. So the blood vessels supplying the skin get wider to increase blood flow to the skin. And that way you're more likely to lose that extra heat. So that's one of the main ways in which you lose heat when you are getting too warm. And that's why people can look quite flush and end up with a lot of blood in their skin, so that they look quite, or they end up with a rosier complexion as a result temporarily. Also, you sweat. So you release a mixture of water and salt and other substances from your sweat glands in your skin. And as the water evaporates, it takes heat away with it to cool you down. So those are two responses for when your body is too cold and when your body is too hot. And the idea is to try to keep the body within a tight range around 37 degrees. Okay, so that's to do with temperature regulation. So next, let's talk about negative feedback, which is another concept. What does it mean? So negative feedback means, or negative feedback refers to responses in the body which cause internal conditions to return to normal levels. Okay, so that's negative feedback. You can also have positive feedback, which isn't quite as common in the body. And that means that when you have a response to a deviation, change from your normal conditions, the response actually causes you to move even further away from your normal conditions. That doesn't normally happen that often, only under certain circumstances where, for instance, there's another response associated which is independent, which when that is triggered causes the positive feedback to stop. So there are some examples like during childbirth. So during childbirth, certain hormones are released which cause contractions. And once the baby is born, those hormones stop being released and the contractions stop. Okay, So next, let's look at blood glucose concentration. So blood glucose concentration, if you've seen previous videos on respiration, you know that glucose is the main respiratory fuel in most organisms. So you need a certain amount of glucose for your tissues and organs to function properly. So if blood glucose level is too low, there isn't enough glucose for respiration. And that can cause your organs to shut down. But also, if your blood glucose level is too high, that too can be a problem. So what's the main problem? So a high level of blood glucose will lead to a decrease in the water potential of blood. Now, that's obviously a problem, because if the water potential of your blood is too low, then any tissues within the blood or any of your organs and tissues which are supplied by the blood will then lose water from their cells in response by osmosis. And that is obviously problematic. So this can then lead to water loss from cells of tissues and organs. And that too can cause your tissues and organs to stop working, to fail. So a low blood glucose concentration is bad because you don't have enough glucose for respiration, but also a very high level of glucose in your blood is also bad, because it means that you can end up with tissue and organ damage due to water loss by osmosis. So you need to try to keep your blood glucose concentration at just the right level in order to actually be able to keep your organs and tissues supplied with energy, but also stop them from being damaged. So how is this achieved? Let's look at this diagram provided there. So in that diagram, you've got two halves, the top half and the bottom half. And you've got a broken line. Now, it looks like it's a straight line, but in reality, it's wavy. So your body is always fluctuating just slightly around a normal level of glucose within the blood. And that's for all sorts of reasons. You're using glucose a little bit faster, or you're using up the glucose a bit slower. It all depends. So let's look at situations where you might stray outside of the normal level. So let's look at the top bit. What might cause your blood glucose level to rise higher than the normal range? It could be just after eating sweets, after drinking a bottle of soft drink, a sugary drink, for instance, anything along those lines. Now, what can your body do in response? The main thing that your body does is it releases insulin. It secretes insulin from your pancreas, from part of the pancreas called the islets of Langerhans. Rather cool name. So the insulin then has a certain effect on the target cells within tissues and organs. And what it does is it has a multi-pronged approach. It has multiple different ways in which it can work. Number one, it causes any excess glucose to be converted into other substances which don't affect water potential, such as glycogen. Another option is that the glucose is taken up by cells more. And if the cells have taken up more of the glucose, then that means there's less of a difference in water potential between the cytoplasm of the cells in your tissues and organs and the blood that has the high level of glucose. Another possibility is that the glucose is used up a little bit faster in some tissues and organs so that you can try to get rid of it, which is why, for instance, children can become quite hyperactive after eating sweets to try to burn away that excess glucose. So those are some of the ways in which you can respond to a high level of glucose to try to get your levels back to a normal range. Now let's look at possible causes of a drop in blood glucose levels. And these are fairly obvious if you think about them. So things like exercise. Exercise uses up more glucose, so you'll end up with less glucose in your blood unless you do something in response. Another possibility is after a period of fasting. So you're probably thinking to yourself, well, you know, fasting, that's really to do with religious people. But actually, if you think about it, when you go to sleep, you're not eating whilst you're sleeping. And so for several hours, you're using up energy, resources, but you're not replenishing them. And that is a form of fasting, which is why the first meal in the day after a night's sleep is called breakfast, break fast. So that's another reason why you could end up with low levels of glucose. So what can your body do in response? Basically the opposite responses to insulin. This time you're going from glycogen to glucose. And that involves a hormone called glucagon. So glucagon causes the conversion of glycogen and other substances into glucose. It also reduces uptake of glucose in cells. And so overall, the net effect that your body is trying to bring about is an increase in the amount of glucose in the blood in response to something that has caused a drop in the amount of glucose in your blood. So all of this is what your body would do under normal circumstances to respond to strange or changes to glucose concentration within the blood. Okay, so osmoregulation. What is that? So basically that's to do with water potential. So we talked earlier about it from the point of view of glucose affecting water potential, but you can have other things affecting water potential, including obviously the amount of water in your blood. So if your blood water potential is too low, then as I said earlier with the glucose example, water is lost from cells in tissues and organs by osmosis. And that water loss can damage tissues and organs. Now let's look at the flip side. What happens if your blood water potential is too high? This causes water to be absorbed by cells in tissues and organs. And because we are animals, our cells don't have a cell wall, and as such, if they absorb too much water, they'll burst, because our membranes, though they are quite resilient, can be quite fragile under certain conditions. So could cause cells to burst. And obviously that will damage tissues and organs. So here are your body's responses. And the key thing you need to take away from this is the role of something called antidiuretic hormone. Antidiuretic hormone stops or decreases your urine production. So if you end up with a very high water potential, say for instance you've been drinking a lot of water, then your body is going to reduce the secretion of ADH, which means that you'll end up producing more urine. And so you'll get rid of that excess water. On the flip side, if, for instance, you've been sweating a lot or something like that that has caused a lot of water to be lost from your body, then you want to retain as much water within your body as physically possible. So you release more ADH, and a greater amount of ADH is that you end up producing less urine, and that way you can retain more of your water within your body. So you're just fine-tuning the amount of water in your blood all the time. Now, where's this antidiuretic hormone coming from? It's coming from a gland very close to your brain called the pituitary gland. We'll talk more about that if you go on to do biology at A level. So that's basically it on the endocrine system. So let's have a quick summary of what we've looked at so far. So first we started off with the path of a normal hormonal response, and it goes from a stimulus to your brain sending instructions to glands, your glands releasing hormones going into the blood, traveling round the body, binding temporarily to receptors in target cells or on target cells, either way, depending on the type of hormone, and then bringing about a response in those target cells within target organs and tissues. Now, as I said earlier in this lesson and in the previous part of this lesson, the specific tissues and organs which respond to hormones are called target tissues and organs. And that's because the cells within them have receptors that are complementary in shape to the shape of the hormones. And then we talked about homeostasis, which is your body's mechanisms which are used to try to maintain a constant internal environment. So things like body temperature, blood glucose levels, and water potential of blood are all very important factors which must be kept within a very tight range in your body, because any serious changes, very large changes in those internal environmental conditions can cause damage to tissues and organs and eventually death. And then we mentioned negative feedback, which is basically your body's response to a change in one of those conditions. Normally, you want to try to get those conditions back to the normal range. And that's what negative feedback is, when the response causes the conditions to go back to the normal range. Whereas positive feedback is the opposite. You end up with a greater deviation from the normal range. And as I said, that's quite rare. And I gave you the example of a hormone involved in childbirth. Okay, so I hope you found that useful. If you did, please click the like button below. And if you haven't already done so, click on the subscribe button so that you get notified whenever I add new videos. As usual, it's helpful to redo this and watch the video and refill the worksheet as many times as necessary in order for all of this information to stick. Good luck, and I'll see you in the next lesson.